I'm going to go ahead and get started with the agenda just because we have a lot of information today, a lot to cover. So we want to make sure we get through it all. So we'll start out with just some goals for the data talks. These are newer to us, so we're going to share what we're trying to accomplish with these. We'll dig into the data on emergent bilingual students. And then we're going to hear from Dr. Suzanne Garcia-Mateos, who's the director of the Monterey Institute for English Learners. And everything we're presenting today has been in collaboration with Miel. So really excited to welcome Suzanne to the presentation and hear her side of things as well. And then we'll have some time for discussion at the end. So if there are things that you'd like to talk about, questions you have about the data, please feel free to write those down as we go. And then we'll have some time for feedback at the end. If there are topics you'd like to see or analyses that you'd like to see, please feel free to get in touch with us. So a little bit about Bright Futures as a partnership. We are our cradle to career partnership, and we work with community organizations throughout Monterey County. We work in 7 different goal areas, and that goes all the way from early care through college completion or post-high school completion and career readiness. And the topic that we have for today is about students who enter school learning to speak English. And I think it's something that touches all of these goal areas. This is the majority of students in our county, and it's something that affects every single one of these goal areas. So really exciting topic for today, and something that is applicable to most of our students. So a little bit about the goals for the talks. Like I said before, this has all been in collaboration with Miel, most of this information that's been put together. So we're excited to share it with our community and increase the accessible sharing and share it in depth. So in different types of analyses, and make sure that we try to uncover what we can in the data. We're also doing this through our data process that we're calling the 5 A's of data equity. So the first one being accessibility. So making data as easy to understand as possible. And then also presenting the information in English and Spanish. Again, we know that most of our community is bilingual and speaks Spanish. So making sure that that's accessible as well. The second is accountability. So making sure that we are accountable to the actions that we take based on the data that we see. The third one is assets, which I think it relates to the entire talk of today. I think bilingualism and biculturalism is a huge asset of our community, but also focusing on some bright spots in the community where folks are doing exceptionally well despite the circumstances. And then we have disaggregation, which is another way of saying we're going to break the data up into different groups. So not just looking at the county as a whole, but looking by region or by school district, by language spoken, or different ways we can disaggregate the data. And then also we're taking a systemic view. So we're looking at the education system as a whole rather than students as individuals, and recognizing that students exist within the system of education. So like I said, we're talking a lot about big ideas, big data analyses and topics, but we want to move towards community work with this information. So looking at localized and disaggregated data for the community in order to do that work. So you might ask, how are we going to do this? So the process that we're using, again, we're moving from local data, so looking at data in Monterey County or for specific groups of students. For today's talk, we're talking about bilingual students or emergent bilingual students, and how their outcomes vary for those students for different school districts or schools. Then we can move into the talking and listening phase. So understanding more from the community what it is that they need to support students who are learning English or bilingual learners. And from there, we can start to move into action. So we can understand what is the work that needs to be done to improve outcomes for this group of students. And that cycles back to the data. So checking the data afterwards and seeing how the outcomes have changed or not, and iterating this process. So we're going to move into talking about the data, and it's a lot of information, but it's not all of the information. So please be aware that these are not all of the analyses that can be done. If there's something else that stands out to you, feel free to get in touch afterwards, and we can talk about if it's possible to look at whatever you're interested in. I also want to take a moment to recognize that we live in a multicultural and multilingual community. So again, these data represent the majority of our students. And it's also interconnected with belongingness and inclusion in our community. So realizing that most of these students experience these English learner labels or other ways of experiencing the system, and realizing that's part of mental health for the students as well. So I just want to point that out before we get into the data today. So we're going to start by talking a little bit about terminology. And you're probably familiar with English learner as a label that is used by schools and school districts and the government to track English proficiency of children. But something we're going to talk about today, a term I'm going to use today is emergent bilingual. And again, this is in collaboration with Miel. This is some of the, changing the way that we're talking about students. And so focusing more on the acquisition and use of a student's full linguistic repertoire for learning and communicating with others. So it reflects more about what students really are, who students really are, that they're bilingual and bicultural. So just be aware of that throughout the presentation. If I say emergent bilingual, I'm talking about this group of students. So this is a big chart. It's going to take a little time to get through it, but because the data today all comes from the California Department of Education, they have different fluency categories depending on how students are put into different placements when they enter school. So there's a home language survey that's given to families when students first enroll, and it just asks, what's the language that's spoken at home? When a student or when a child speaks, what language do they normally use? And so that, based on the results of that survey, students may be tested for their English fluency. And so the first category, these green boxes at the top, are students who enter school speaking English fluently. So either English is the only language spoken in their home, or they speak a language other than English, but they've tested as being fluent in English initially. So they've taken that first initial LPAC test and they've passed with English fluency. So the other groups of students are students who enter school learning to speak English, which are sometimes referred to as EVER-EL students. And that's a group of students we're going to focus on today. So these could be students who did not pass that initial LPAC test, so they're not able to communicate fluently in English. So they would be labeled as English learners. And then this also includes students who were formerly English learners, but have reclassified, have become fluent in English since they were English learners. So we know that in Monterey County, in the most recent enrollment data, about 39% of students entered school speaking English fluently. And breaking this down, we know that 35% of all students are English-only students, they only speak English, or monolingual students. And then about 3% speak in a language other than English, but were fluent when they came into school. So this means that 61% of students are in this EVER-EL category. They entered school learning to speak English. And then the other categories, the EL and RFEP, they fluctuate depending on the grades that students are in. So we can look at this also across all of California. And this is something that I think is really exciting, is that Monterey County has the highest percentage of students who enter school learning to speak English. So if you look at this map here, I've pointed to Monterey County, and we can see that the darkness of the green on this map represents the percentage of students who enter school learning to speak English. So you see Monterey County is one of the darkest ones there. And right now, the most current data, 36% of students are designated as English learners or emergent bilingual students. So another way of thinking about this, if we had a classroom of about 20 students, 12 of them would have entered learning to speak English. So they speak another language in addition to English. We can also look by region. We know that Monterey County is very large, so sometimes it's good to look at the 4 different regions within the county. So we have North County, Salinas, the Peninsula and Big Sur, and then South County. So this is again the percent of students who are EVER-EL or emergent bilingual students. It's highest in South County and lowest in the Peninsula or Big Sur. You see that the whole Salinas Valley has a larger percentage of students who enter school learning to speak English. So we can also look, there's some really good reports out there about the language groups that students speak through in the different counties. And so I took just here the top 5 languages that students speak. Probably not surprising that Spanish is the #1 language there. We know that 60% of all of our students speak Spanish. And if we look at all of the students who speak multiple languages, Spanish makes up 93% of those students. So it's overwhelmingly majority Spanish. The second is Mixteco, which is a Mexican indigenous language that's spoken by many folks throughout our county as well. This makes up about 1% of all of our students. The third category is, it's kind of unfortunate, it's other non-English languages. So we're not able to say a lot about this category, other than we can make some guesses that many of these students may speak Triqui. Triqui is another Mexican indigenous language, and it's not captured by the list of languages that occur in this report. So we know from just anecdotal evidence that many folks speak Triqui within the county, but it's not captured within this report. So that's about 1% of students. And then we have Arabic and Filipino as number 4 and 5. So here are some results from, again, this is the LPAC test, or the English Language Proficiency Assessment for California. And this is last year's data. That's the most current data that we have. So this is the summative LPAC, which is what's used to reclassify students as fluent in English. It's not the initial test to see if students need to be labeled as English learners or not. And so what we're looking at are the different levels. So it's level 1 is the lowest, the least developed, and level 4 is the most developed. And we see that about 13% of our students are at level 4. And that's one of the ways that students can reclassify. It's not the only way. It's not the only criteria, but we do know that that's kind of a low percentage of our students, and that many students are at levels 2 and 3. And it's not overwhelmingly surprising, because a lot of the students who end up at level 4 will then reclassify and then would not be in this group of students who are taking the LPAC. We also know that throughout California, it's about 16% of students who are in level 4. So we're a little bit lower than the statewide average. We can look at this data a little bit closer. And so there's different parts of the test and different ways that you can be biliterate or bilingual, fluent in English. And so there's the oral language performance and then also written. And so I've broken it up into these 2 categories here. And you can see that level 4 are the yellow bars at the top, and level 1 is at the bottom in purple. And so we see that for oral language performance, there's a larger percentage of students who reach that level 4 well-developed category, versus written language performance, only 6% of students are at level 4. So a lot of improvement in terms of written language performance. We can also look at different domains. So there's 4 different domains. It's reading, writing, speaking, and listening. And so the reading domain had the lowest level 4 performance. That seems to be the most difficult for students to achieve level 4. That was only 8% of our students who took this test. Whereas the speaking domain seemed to be maybe the easiest for students to pass. 40% of students who took the test were at level 4 for speaking. So from that, we can look at reclassification data throughout the county. So this is different grade levels. We can look for each grade level, but I chose kind of some junctures in the grade levels. So about a quarter of students, 25 or 26% of students reclassified by 6th grade, about half by 7th grade, about 70% by high school or by 9th grade. And then by 12th grade, it's about 80% of students. So again, I think there's a lot of improvement that and a lot of potential for students to reclassify earlier, and for more students to reclassify, especially before high school, as fluent in English. And I also want to point out that this calculation, it excludes students who've been English learners or emergent bilinguals for less than 4 years. So there's a way that we can kind of subtract those students out if they came into the school system a little bit later and they haven't received enough instruction. This does not account for those students. So I want to give a shout back to our last data talk we talked about students with disabilities in Monterey County. And part of the conversation was talking with folks in the community who are doing that work. Something that came up with all those conversations was that we also have to focus on language, because many students who are learning to speak English can be designated as having a disability as well, whether that's correct or not. And so there's kind of some disproportionality there. So I want to give just a couple statistics about these students that we talked about last time. If this is of interest, we have the full recording and presentation on our website, so feel free to check that out. But again, we know 36% of students are emergent bilinguals. We also know about 16% of emergent bilingual students in our county also have a disability. So this is compared to about 12% of all students have a disability in Monterey County. So there's a slight overrepresentation for these students where there's that kind of overlap of these two categories. And we also know that about half, or about 45% of students with disabilities are emergent bilingual students. So it's kind of the other way of looking at that. And we also shared some information about reclassification for this group of students. So kind of separating out if students have disabilities or not. And we see that the purple bars here are for students with disabilities. And at each grade level, there were fewer students, or a lower percentage of students, who reclassified compared to their peers without disabilities. So realizing that we also need to support students with disabilities who are emergent bilinguals even more than all emergent bilingual students. So something else that I think is really exciting and has a lot of potential to celebrate the bilingualism of the community and then also of the whole state is the state seal of biliteracy. So this is something that students who graduate from high school can earn on their diploma. It's a little seal that says, I don't know exactly what it says, but shows that they are biliterate. And so I've broken it down here by different racial and ethnic categories that we have. You can also see that for Monterey County, we have 11% of our graduates are earning this seal. Statewide, it's about 12% of students. And we can see that it's highest among Pacific Islander, Hispanic or Latino, Filipino, and Asian students, and lower rates among African American and Native American students. So some things to point out, I also looked at the rates for different languages that students were learning. And we know that about 84% of these students who earned the seal of biliteracy spoke Spanish, either as their first or second language. And we also know about 72% of the students were former emergent bilingual students. So many of the students came into school learning English and have now earned this seal of biliteracy. But I think something important to note, and this is shown on the next graph, is that there's a long way to go and a lot of support that we can offer to students to try to increase these numbers, because we do know that the majority of our students are already bilingual or emergent bilingual when they enter school. And so to increase the percentage of students who are earning the seal of biliteracy and getting that credential. So you can see here, I've taken, again, the seal of biliteracy rate that was the same on the previous slide, but now I've put it next to the percent of emergent bilingual students who are entering as emergent bilinguals in kindergarten. And so unfortunately, I can't look at the EVER-EL numbers by race and ethnicity. That's just a limitation of the data. And so I've done kind of the next best thing, is looked at kindergarten students by race and ethnicity who are emergent bilinguals. So that's why you'll see over here, Monterey County, that's 51%, and that doesn't match the 61% that we were talking about earlier. But a few things I want to point out on here. The first is for Native American students. And we see that 58% of those students in kindergarten were emergent bilinguals, but none of them achieved the seal of biliteracy in the most recent year. And so I think there's a lot of support that we can offer, we should be thinking about offering for students who speak Indigenous languages, and making sure that that is recognized by the seal of biliteracy, in addition to other languages that are more common. We also see that there's still some discrepancy for Hispanic or Latino students. So again, knowing that many of those students speak Spanish, and 60% of them enter school as emergent bilinguals, but only 12% are earning the seal of biliteracy. And again, this is the majority of our students fall into this race and ethnicity category. So making sure we support the majority of our students to earn this seal of biliteracy. So I'm going to talk about a few bright spots, some really exciting things happening in our community. And I think the first one is something we've already talked about. So that 65% of our students are bilingual or emergent bilingual students. And I think that's a huge asset to our community and something we should definitely focus on as an asset. The next one is about reclassification. So remember, these were the rates for Monterey County as a whole in terms of reclassification. And I looked at a few different school districts. I looked specifically at unified school districts because they contain all of these grade levels. And so at Soledad Unified, there was some really exciting data. We see that in 5th grade, actually students are reclassifying at slightly lower rates than the countywide average. But by 7th grade, they've made that up. And now 62% of students have reclassified, and that's 10 percentage points higher than the countywide average. And then we see kind of the similar trends into high school years. So really exciting things happening at Soledad, understanding a little bit more about how they support emergent bilingual students to reclassify would be really important. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a Tableau dashboard that we put together with Miel. So I'm going to stop sharing this screen. And I will share the Tableau. So it's kind of an exciting way to look at the language data. And again, we know that geographically, we're a really large county and we have many different districts. So this helps you look at the data by district and also by language. So it defaults to Spanish, again, because that's the largest group of students speak Spanish in our county, but you would be able to click in here and choose any language you would like. Some of them are represented and some are not. So you could click Mixteco if you are interested in looking at the data for that language. But you'll see that we can look at the total number of students who speak that language, the percent of all students who speak that language, the percent who are English learners who speak that language, and then by district, kind of a similar thing here. You can also hover over the different districts and it will tell you kind of the same data, but just, then you can look for the different districts. You can also filter for district type. So if, for example, you're only interested in unified school districts or something. And then we also have information here about the most common languages that are spoken. Again, that was what I described earlier, but it has a few more languages represented here. So that's a really exciting thing. I think I asked Jeannie to put the link in the chat if you would like to look at the Tableau. I think it can be a really great resource for folks. So I'm going to go back to PowerPoint. Okay, so just giving a little bit of summary of the data before we move on. That Monterey County has the highest percentage of students who enter school learning to speak English. It's 61%, so the majority. We also know that Spanish and Mixteco are the most commonly spoken languages in our county, at least for that K-12 data. Potentially there could be different data for all of the adults in our county in terms of the second or third languages that are most common. We also know that that percentage is highest in South County and lowest in the peninsula. We know about 13% of the students who took the LPAC last year were at that level 4 where they were eligible for reclassification. About half of emergent bilingual students reclassify as fluent by high school. About 45% of students with disabilities are also learning to speak English. So some overlap there. The rates of reclassification are lower for emergent bilingual students with disabilities. So again, remembering we need to support that intersectionality of those students. 11% of the graduates in Monterey County last year earned the seal of biliteracy. So a lot of opportunity for growth in that regard, making sure that more students are able to earn the seal. About 65% of students in Monterey County are multilingual. Again, this is a huge asset for our community. And shout out to Soledad, they have 3 of every 4 emergent bilingual students reclassifying by high school. So with that, I want to welcome Dr. Suzanne Garcia-Mateos. She's with us from Miel, and just open the floor for her. She's going to share a little bit more about bilingual authorization for teachers in our county.
Thank you, Mallory. Buenas tardes, bienvenidos, bienvenidas a todos. So I'm Suzanne Garcia-Mateos. I'm the director of Miel. I'm also the coordinator of the Bilingual Authorization Program, and I'm going to share just a little bit about that. So the Bilingual Authorization Program at CSUMB gives teachers the opportunity to teach in Spanish. And so our program is a bilingual authorization in Spanish. It's running this summer. And for the first time ever, we'll be running the program all year round. And I can share more about that if people are interested. The prerequisites are to pass the CSET 3, which is basically a test to see if you know Spanish in reading, writing, listening, and speaking, and then have a valid California teaching credential. It's 3 courses. They're all taught in Spanish. This program is for elementary and secondary teachers. And so if you are interested in me presenting to teachers or just sharing more about the bilingual authorization, I'm more than happy to do so. On the next slide, I wanted to talk about the bilingual teacher pipeline. And so as you can see, based on Mallory's presentation about all of this amazing data, is that we need more bilingual teachers. And we especially need them in special ed. I think there's just a lot of opportunity there for teachers in general, but even more so in bilingual ed, special ed. And so I just wanted to share this table with you. Our program started in 2019. We started with 11 students, and now I'm in the process of trying to enroll 50 students. We're right in the middle of registration, and that's why I said trying. But as you can see, our numbers have gone up. They took a dip a little bit because of the pandemic, like most universities. And then one of the things that we're learning is that once students complete our program, not all of them apply for the bilingual authorization because they're trying to pass standardized tests like the RICA, like a TPA. And so I just wanted to highlight that this idea of standardization continues at the university level. Earlier, Mallory was talking about being reclassified, which is a standardized test. And they just, those kinds of assessment really don't test what students know and how well they actually speak any language, but they're what we have to use, right, as measurement tools for what we do in education. And so that's all I have to share. Happy to answer any questions or dialogue more about just emergent bilinguals and bilingualism here in the Monterey County. Mallory, I don't know if we have time, but I did want to share just a short video. Is that okay, or should I wait till later?
No, you could share it now if you'd like.
Okay.
I think you have sharing permission.
Okay.
But let me know if you don't.
One of the things I try to do in my courses is, and when I work with bilingual teachers, is really humanize what it means to be an emergent bilingual and what it means to be assessed, quite frankly. Y'all hear a lot from us, adults, about data and emergent bilinguals, but we rarely hear from kids. And so one of the things I try to do is not just humanize this experience, but personalize it. Like Mallory was saying, most of our students in the Monterey County have that English learner label. And like she was saying, they're also just bilingual people. And my daughters are considered English learners who have been reclassified. And so they've been subjected to the LPAC test. But I don't really see them as English learners. I just see them as bilingual people, like the majority of the students with this English learner label. The majority of them were born and raised here, and their majority are just bilingual people. And so the video I'm going to show you is my daughter. She's 9 years old and in 4th grade. She was reclassified last year. And this year, she was very anxious about the LPAC and about standardized testing in general. And so with her permission, I asked if I could record her response to potentially being assessed again with the LPAC. I reminded her that she's no longer going to be assessed because she reclassified. So she let me just share a little bit about how she perceived being assessed every year. That's the video I'm showing you. And I'm asking her in the video, I'm speaking Spanish, she's speaking English over translanguaging. I'm asking her well, you'll see. I'm asking her what she thinks about being bilingual and the testing. So can you see my screen? Okay, so this is Sienna.
What happened to the bilingual kids at your school, mamas?
So everyone in my grade last year that were bilingual, they had to like take a test because they're bilingual, and then I was the last one to finish, and then I had nothing fun, and I missed out on this little like thing where you cut wood and you build stuff, and that sounded really cool, but I couldn't do it. And then if you're like good at the test, they give you more tests and more questions and harder questions.
Ah, ok. ¿Y cómo te sientes siendo bilingüe?
Good.
Sí, pero cuando te dan esos tipos de exámenes en tu cole porque eres bilingüe, ¿qué te hace pensar?
That they don't like people that are bilingual. They don't want people that are bilingual.
Ah, ¿y los exámenes eran bilingual exámenes? ¿O qué eran? ¿Eran en inglés o en español?
English.
¿Solo inglés? Ah, el examen no era bilingüe.
No, that's what Miss G told me, that all the people that were bilingual in my grade went to the LPAC test.
Pero tú sabes que ser bilingüe es un superpower, ¿ya? Y porque tú sabes inglés, español y mandarín, ¿verdad? ¿Puedes decir algo en español para mami?
Te amo, mami.
Te amo, Baba. Besito.
So there you have the perspective and the experience of a 9-year-old. And my other daughter, who's 13, could also share, but she didn't want to. So I'm happy. I'll just end with that, and I'm happy to answer any questions, or if watching this video and hearing about data created any thoughts. I don't know if this is a good time to share, or if we should wait till the end, Mallory.
Yeah, I think we can open it up for discussion about the topics Suzanne presented or any of the topics earlier. Happy to open it up. So feel free to unmute or enter in the chat if you have specific questions for us.
I'll jump in with the first question. I'm a bit under the weather, so forgive me if my voice isn't quite what it excuse me, what it normally is. Suzanne, I'm really curious. So thank you for being here and thank you for sharing. I feel like you were touching on mental health and belongingness there, and I'm curious about what you see as kind of the greatest potential for change, opportunity kind of around how we treat multilingualism in Monterey County. And you also touched on the bilingual authorization. So just curious where you kind of see the greatest opportunities for change in the community.
Hi, Michael. Yeah, thank you for that question. I think it's a great question with a complex answer. And so I think if I had to say one thing about that is that we need more bilingual education programming here in the Monterey County. In 2016, Proposition 58 passed, which gave families in the community the legal right to bilingual education that they did not have for almost 20 years in the state of California. So I would advocate for more bilingual education programs, specifically the dual language model, either the one-way or the two-way. I think that's one of the huge things we could do here in the county, and schools are starting to do that.
Thanks, Suzanne, for that.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts in general or questions that you have for us?
I saw Janet's, hi Janet, we haven't met except in chat. I saw Janet's comment about supporting students from that speak an indigenous language. I wanted to share that one of the ways that I promote supporting the linguistic diversity in our schools is through what they call translanguaging pedagogy. Translanguaging, literally for me, when I define translanguaging, I give Spanglish as an example. For example, in the video that y'all watched, I was speaking in Spanish and English, and my daughter was speaking in English. She understood everything I said, and I understood everything she said, obviously. That's translanguaging. And so if we raise awareness around translanguaging in our schools in any classroom, we open up the opportunity for students to use their full linguistic repertoire. So use the indigenous languages that they speak in the classroom for learning, even if the teacher doesn't speak their language.
Thanks for sharing that, Suzanne.
Yeah, I'm also happy to share awareness around that through a presentation or through meeting with parents or teachers. So feel free to reach out.
Just to add to that conversation about Indigenous languages, something that really stood out to me when I was looking at the data for the CELA biliteracy is that Mixteco is not a language that can be assessed in that way. Students are not able to obtain the CELA biliteracy if that is their first or second language in our county, at least. I think there's only one or two counties in California where that is a language where you're allowed to get the CELA biliteracy. So I think part of that too is just the way that it's tested for, like there has to be a test for it, and students have to pass that fluency test to show that they are proficient in that language as well. So I think that is huge for us as a county. We know that that's the second highest percentage of students are in that group if they speak multiple languages. So making sure that we're spreading awareness of that and having the opportunity for students to share their proficiency and to hone in on their languages that they grew up with.
Yeah, and I know they've made changes to the seal by literacy recently. I forget which bill speaks to this, but there is like, in order to be able to get the seal by literacy, you have to have like full reclassification as an English learner, which is really an inequity because as you can see, I use my daughter as an example, like a lot of the students are bilingual people. And so I think there's work to be done around that too. Like they should have access to getting the seal by literacy as well, even if they haven't reclassified.
Yeah. So a lot of policy work that can be done and other awareness and actions that we can take. Any other thoughts that came up during the presentation? We have a few minutes.
I guess I have a question about, I've worked with several students at Sylvan who should not have been ELL, they were misclassified. So I don't know if those numbers relate to your data. And I know I have helped several students to get them out of the program. They're not reclassified, but they can get, a lot of parents don't know that their kids could be opted out of it.
Yeah, unfortunately, I can't see that in the data, like those small nuances, but yes, that would definitely be a problem. Unfortunately, yeah, there are just some ways that we're not able to disaggregate the data. So for example, another thing is like looking at graduation rates or college going rates or something. I'm not able to see students who were at one point English learners and then graduated from high school. I can only see students who are currently English learners. So there's a lot of inequities in the data as well in terms of looking at these different categories and how students reclassified or not and when they reclassified and how their outcomes have improved over time. So I think that's also something that's, maybe it's at the policy level in terms of asking CDE to do better data reporting, but just being able to understand more about our students and how they progress throughout the system.
And maybe help parents when they're filling out that form, especially in kindergarten, that they know what they're clicking. And these students are bilingual, but English is their first language. I mean, they're not struggling with English.
Well,
I mean, they may have some other struggles, but if parents could know how to fill out that form so it's filled out properly.
I think that's tricky. because a lot of the emergent bilinguals are simultaneous bilinguals. So for example, my children, they just know both languages the whole time since they were born. That's how we describe it. But I know what you mean, Carrie. I'm thinking about students who are monolingual Spanish speakers, and not so much bilingual students. But I do think that we need to support their bilingualism in the classroom, whether they are monolingual or bilingual or multilingual. The other thing I wanted to point out, because you brought up another point, is opting out of services. I come from Texas, that's why I say y'all. But here it's easy to opt out. It's not encouraged, but it is easy to do that. In fact, federal policy says that you can, it's just not advertised. And so I think you're right, we need to raise more awareness around that, about not just for parents, but for schools, because I know schools get funding with the more English learners that they have. So.
I think, Mallory, if I could just share, I think two things are coming to mind. One is kind of the way that students reclassify, and they typically have to pass not only the LPAC around fluency, but also the SBAC, the regular English language arts test. And I think that the interesting thing there is students who enter school speaking English, only about half of them pass the English language arts test. So most students who enter school speaking English would not be able to reclassify into English, if that makes sense. So I think that that's an interesting nuance as well, that I think it's 51%, Mallory, you could correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's 51% of students pass the SBAC who speak English. And so I think that that's an interesting thing there as well. And I think another thing, and Suzanne and I have been in conversation about potential opportunities for research, but in terms of opting out, I think another interesting nuance is we don't know what the best grade is to reclassify. So when we look at the 5th grade and 8th grade, and there was one study that was done, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago or something like that, and they didn't have a solid conclusion around how it negatively or positively impacts future college or high school graduation or something like that when you reclassify. So there's some people who argue, we want to reclassify as soon as possible, let's say in 5th grade or something like that, and others who say reclassifying sooner actually takes away some of the supports that you may have that lead to greater success. So I think an interesting thing is, we do know that the dual language programs kind of end up ultimately having the best results. But in those schools that don't have the dual language programs, we don't even know exactly when is the best time to reclassify. And I think that systemically, one of the pieces that's really important is if you're still labeled as an English learner in high school, you typically have to take extra support classes for English, which takes the place of other courses that you would take that are often A to G classes. And so systemically, you end up being less likely to be able to go to a UC or a CSU out of high school because of having that English learner designation. So that's we talk about systemic inequities and measuring systemic inequities, but that is potentially a way that we prevent students who are multilingual from being able to go to a UC or a CSU.
Thanks for bringing that up, Michael. It's good to keep in mind. Since we're running low on time here, I'm just going to share the calendar for the rest of the talks for the rest of the year here. So you can see next month we'll be talking about FAFSA and CAUTA completion for our high school graduates. and then no data talk in July. So look forward to these topics to come. If there's a specific topic that you're really interested in and you don't see it here or in our past talks, please feel free to get in touch with me. Also, if there are any analyses that you think would be specifically interesting or useful for your work, do get in touch, and we'd be happy to try to do those analyses if possible, or provide the data or any other support that you might need. So thank you again for being here this afternoon. We really appreciate it and the conversation. I think I speak for Suzanne as well. This is really great to talk with some folks about the work that we've been doing. So thank you again. I've put my email here. Suzanne's email is in a previous slide. All of these slides and the recording will be on our website following the talk. So look out for that. Futuresmc.org, I think. So you can access our website and all of the talks and the recording as well. So feel free to check those out and share them as you see fit. So thanks again for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mallory.